Hey, welcome everybody. Everybody having a good time? It's my privilege to introduce this panel discussion, MedTech Innovation. It's exciting, it's complex, let's unpack it. I'm Alicia Howell, I'm co-founder and CEO of Codebase and co-chair of the Geekend executive team. You're in this room, so you probably already understand that Savannah is a hotbed of MedTech right now. If you don't already understand that, you're about to, so buckle your seatbelt. This discussion is going to run 30 minutes with 20 minutes for Q&A. Our panel moderator is a veritable mountain of achievement, a former Fortune 500 executive and tech startup founder. She currently serves as principal at StrategyRx and chief marketing officer of Micro-C Imaging, in addition to being unparalleled in her grace and charm. It's my honor to introduce Murem Sharpe.
Thank you. I'm already a hard act to follow. I was just glad I wasn't after Jesse this morning. I was, just to thank the sponsors. But I am just thrilled to be here with this sterling panel that we have. Each one of them could be up here for an hour and a half each. And I hope you seek them out after our panel and into the future. Medical technology innovation is really a breathtaking field, and it's very broad and very deep. So we're going to try to cover as much as we can in the next less than an hour. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce herself and himself. And yeah, why do we have 4 women and 1 man? Could it be that I was the panel moderator? No, it just happened that way. I mean, I do know Greg and I do know Tiffany, but these sterling additional people to my left came through referrals. So there we go. So I'm going to we're just going to go across, and then I have some questions that I'm going to ask. And then the way we're going to kick off the Q&A is I'm asking each of the panelists to think of a question they would like to ask of one of the other panelists to keep them as engaged as the audience is. So first, Tiffany, please introduce yourself.
So I'm Tiffany Wilson. I'm the CEO of the Global Center for Medical Innovation based in Atlanta, GCMI. We're a nonprofit organization launched about 6 years ago to work with medtech innovators, entrepreneurs, startup companies, new product development teams to design, build, and test new technology. I started in this industry about 15 years ago, a little over 15 years ago, not from a technical background. I actually studied international business and did consulting and investment banking for a few years prior to going back and getting my MBA, and got into the industry as an investment banker, raising money for a startup out of Boston. And so there was an opportunity for me to join the management team of that company to lead finance and strategy, and that was my entree into medtech, and I completely fell in love with it. And so after spending about 10 years in medical device startups and living all the challenges and frustrations that medtech companies go through, when GCMI kind of came to light, I saw a unique opportunity to build something from scratch to help other entrepreneurs. So that's where we are right now.
So my name is Greg Kolovich. I'm actually an orthopedic surgeon, but I started a company called Micro-C, just sort of out of my own frustrations of dealing with medical imaging in the operating room. So we started in 2016, so we're about 2 years old actually. We've made a lot of success, and just, you know, things keep spinning off. We keep doing more and more projects, creating more and more devices, and it's like Tiffany said, you know, she told me a long time ago that you'd be along for a ride, and it truly is a ride. But I think what inspired me to join MedTech was just, you know, as doctors, we're basically taught to do things algorithmically by the book. You know, there's a way to do a surgical procedure, and this is how you do it. But it's sort of counterintuitive because there's so many things that can be innovated in medical technology. And I was an engineer from Georgia Tech, so I took my engineering background and kind of implemented that in my everyday surgeries, and I decided I'm going to make things better instead of, you know, going by the book, and if I see a problem, I'm going to try to fix it, and that's what I've been doing, and that's what I'm here to talk about. So excited to be here.
Thank you, Greg. Cory.
Hey, so I'm Kory Toler-Franklin. I'm a tenure-track faculty member at the University of Florida, and I'm the principal investigator and director of the Graphics Imaging and Light Measurement Lab there. And my research is at the intersection of computer vision, computer graphics, and optics. So I build devices for capturing information. We have a light measurement lab, so I actually do physically based measurements of light reflectance, and so we can simulate materials. And from a computer graphics standpoint, I develop algorithms for figuring out how we can make all this data useful to professionals in in the biomedical field. My work is also used by archaeologists in Greece and other places. And so that's kind of like the research background. And how I got there, I actually began as an architect at Cornell. In the architecture school there, I traveled a lot, did a lot of Cornell abroad in Africa and different places. And then I got my master's in computer graphics from Cornell as well. And then I got my PhD in computer science at Princeton. And before I actually went to UF, I was a postdoc at UC Davis, and I had affiliations at Yale and Berkeley. And before getting my PhD, I actually worked in industry. And so my frustrations are kind of like, I hear the frustration because I was frustrated as an architecture student. That's how I got into computer science. I was an architect and I was frustrated. That's why I was working at Autodesk as a software engineer. And then I worked at Google and also at Adobe doing research projects.
Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Hood. I'm an attorney at HunterMaclean here in Savannah. I work in our corporate practice group, but my specific area is a kind of mix between intellectual property. So I help clients figure out what rights they needed to protect for their innovations. And the other side of what I do is information technology, so negotiating contracts, setting up privacy and data security policies, helping clients understand where the HunterMaclean, and we're one of the only law firms in the area that offer these types of services. So I was able to find the balance between family life and the innovation and exciting nature of this business. So that's why I'm here. I'm excited to talk to you more about the legal questions that I'm sure you all have, and I appreciate you being here today.
The field of medicine and medical technology innovation is very broad and complex, as we said in our subtitle. So help explain it. Help us understand how it's organized, at least from your perspective. And we'll start with Tiffany, who travels the world and has probably answered this question before.
So the way that I organize it, well, it's always framework based, right? Kind of coming from my analyst days. You want to put things in buckets, but the challenge now is that everything's kind of getting mishmashed. But typically, I would think about it in terms of pharmaceuticals, biologics, and medical devices, because those are the buckets that FDA regulates. So I use that as the core. The difference is that, or the interesting time that we're in, is all of these things are converging, where and data is now a big part of that equation, typically on the device side. So we're seeing, everybody's heard of digital health and health IT and those sorts of things. And 10 years ago, those technologies existed in and of themselves, but now they're really integrated into devices and diagnostics, where it comes to new therapies, new pharmaceuticals, new biologic. We get into the areas of drug delivery, and so then you're developing new catheters and systems for getting these technologies, these drugs into the body, or to stay in a specific space in the body. And so it's these weird complex things with pharma and mechanical engineering and the connected nature of it. And then I think we're seeing a lot of growth in the diagnostic field, where you're seeing physical devices with complex algorithms and the data piece, trying to predict into the future, risk for disease, and then targeted ways to deliver medicines to either prevent or cure those diseases. So it's the interesting part about it for me, particularly coming from the business side, is watching groups of technologists learn how to work together. So very early on, medical device technology, which is my specialty, you'd see mechanical engineers working together, and that was it. And even 6 years ago when we launched GCMI, it was very mechanically driven. And so now we'll have in the room the mechanical engineer and the software designer, and maybe even someone from industrial design. And so those personalities and those areas of technical expertise are so different, but they really do have to learn how to work together as a team to get some of these therapies done. And so that is just, it's fascinating to watch, and it certainly presents a challenge, but that's kind of where we are now.
I'm going to ask Greg the same question, but with a twist. First of all, I know quite a bit about Micro-C, and I'm not here with that label on today. But Micro-C is considered a medical device, but there's software and there's services. How do you think the medical community should look at what you're trying to do? And with that, what kind of team do you have to support this solution, because it's more than a device?
Well, I think everything starts with an idea, and not all these ideas are possible. And sometimes we create ideas or solutions to problems that don't exist. So I was fortunate enough to come up with something to find a problem that needed a solution. And it just turns out that the way we shoot medical imaging in the operating room, x-rays, even photos, videos, even infrared thermal imaging, all that stuff is very archaic, and the design really hasn't changed in 60 years, but nobody had the thought to say, hey, let's try to change it. Let's make things smaller, faster, quicker. Let's get more resolute imaging. Or even if they did, they didn't know how to do it. And when we first started this, I mean, I don't know how many times we've been told it's impossible. And I was told by engineers from GE, Philips, Siemens, Stryker, all the big wigs, saying it's physically impossible. But the biggest thing is that I was an engineer, so I would take apart x-rays, and I probably know more about x-ray tubes than anybody I've ever met, outside of the engineers on our team, or more about x-rays than I ever wanted to. But the key is you always want to think outside the box. And the reason why people thought it was impossible, because they didn't think about what the problem was, and it is about cooling the x-ray tube. So we thought of a really patented novel way of cooling the x-ray tube. So once we did it, and once we proved that it was possible, then it becomes, well, how do we, once you develop a prototype, you've got to develop it. And that's where you need people that are a lot smarter than you, who are more talented. And then once you get that going, you get a good team. You need engineers, you need business people, you need marketing people. The key for me was learning my own limitations. I'm still a very busy surgeon by day, and I don't have all the technical background to build circuits and create alloys and heat sinks and all that stuff. So I had to get a really smart team. Truth is that the world is very small now because we're all connected by the internet, so you can always find someone. We've done contract work with people in Switzerland and India, Canada, all throughout the world, and these people are approached by the click of a button. So that is a huge advantage in today's world as opposed to 50 or 60 years ago. And things are done very fast. So if you can't do it yourself, find someone who can, and often you can find someone who's much better and smarter and brighter than you. But really, developing the team is everything. And I would venture to say, and I think Tiffany would agree, that most startups fail, not because they had a bad idea, because they had bad execution. So executing and developing your idea is huge, and we'll get into that more as we move on. But developing the team, you've got to. I had to fire one of our guys on Valentine's Day. It wasn't personal, but it's business. You got to find the right guy. or the right gal. And, you know, and the key for us was staying on the same page and staying focused. You can't, you have to have something with a very limited focus, and you've got to stick to everyday grind to get that done. And I think the problem with a lot of startups is they try to make that device or those devices that do everything. And then you get lost, because it's like you essentially lost what your focus was, and that was, I'm going to create a handheld X-ray that weighs 5 pounds or less, that has better resolution and better and much safer radiation profile. And that was our goal. Now, it has since spinning off to do other projects, but that's not on the critical path of creating, developing, and selling this device. So stay focused, get a good team, and ultimately find people who are smarter than you.
Thanks, Greg. Now, Cory, I'll put you on the spot in this broad field of medicine and medical innovation. With your prowess in computer science and data gathering and analysis, how do you view this industry as they come knocking on your door, begging you to do research and implementation?
So my view is through a very focused lens. It's from the perspective of a computer scientist who wants to visualize things, but not just visualize things, but we want to make sure that when we capture things, it has a certain amount of scientific accuracy. It's not good enough anymore to look at something. You have to be able to measure things. You have to be able to make sure it's accurate. So I see 3 areas. I see the mechanical part, where you have this engineering, this great innovation that's happening, where devices are becoming flexible, portable, intuitive, used more for a broad set of applications across a number of disciplines within this kind of biomedical arena. I see a second area where I fall kind of square in the middle of, where there are a lot of partnerships between industry and institutions. Like, I work very closely with the Shands Hospital and their oncology department. So being able to leverage these really high-end computer science algorithms for work in that field. And I think computer vision is probably really an interesting thing with, now we have deep learning algorithms that are much more precise, and being able to use that to help with diagnostics. There are a lot of ethical issues also with that, because you never want the expert out of the loop, because you want to make sure that you're predicting things correctly. And I think the last area I would say is in visualization and output, whether it's commercially or through a service, being able to visualize things. So one area of research is this computer-assisted surgery, virtual surgery, being able to make accurate models and then tie that with haptic devices to be able to use it for surgery prep. And now with 3D printing, a lot of 3D printing is being used now. Output is being used to help with surgery prep. So being able to actually have a physical model to work with. So from my computer science perspective, these are the 3 areas I see in the field.
Thank you. That gives us yet another interesting perspective. And now our attorney is going to tell us what she sees coming at her in medicine and health IT.
Well, we often joke when people come to us, we're the paid pessimists, right? So we kind of look at it from 3 different backgrounds. The first and probably the most important from an innovator's perspective is, what are you doing that's different? Your intellectual property. You want to make sure that you're protecting that, and to understand how to protect that, you have to understand what you have. So getting, kind of like what Greg was saying, getting the right people in early so that you can kind of unpack your ideas and figure out, do you need NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, with your design people, with, say you're pitching it to investors. You know, if this is so innovative, you want to make sure that you're doing something to protect it. The second area from a legal perspective, along with what I was saying, is what contracts do you need? You know, I think a lot of entrepreneurs look at me and say, I need to write this down. We have an agreement. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't have it written down and have a clear kind of even letter of intent perspective, when someone comes and takes your idea, you don't have any legal ramifications for that. And the third perspective, from a lawyer's perspective at least, is what's the regulatory background? Tiffany mentioned the FDA. there's a lot of regulations out there. They're talking about adding more security regulations, which are most likely needed, but understanding what you're doing. There's a lot of federal and state data security requirements. So what kind of data are you dealing with? Is it personal health information? Is it credit card numbers? What is your app or innovation or medical device doing, and how can you make sure that you're in compliance with the law? And these are all the types of things that getting the right lawyer in place at the beginning of your project can really help facilitate and save you money in the long run.
It's much cheaper to do it right the first time.
Exactly.
And now the next question is, tell us about some exciting innovation that I'm going to ask you, not that you're personally or professionally involved in, but that you see in the field that you would like to share with this group. And don't all run off to your stockbrokers after this, or well, maybe you want to. Maybe it's not even near an IPO.
So I think that the neat thing about GCMI is we get to see things when they come in as ideas. And so our head of product development kind of refers to it as playing with fire. It's the stuff that large medical device companies never really get to see. And most of it will fail. Gosh, the most exciting one, that's tough. The problems that medical technology solves is kind of what I get excited about, and really figuring out the business models. So really understanding what the end game is. Healthcare, we all know, is changing. It's been going through rapid change over the last 4 or 5 years, and a lot of people are focused on the shift from volume to value. I'm sure, Greg, that's kind of the world that you're living in. And so as a result, the technologies, the technologies that are being developed, the technologies that I think will be successful are those that are really addressing that value. So how do you decrease surgical time? How do you get a patient out of the hospital faster? How do you work within the shifting healthcare paradigms where procedures or behavioral care is being done more in the patient's own environment and out of the healthcare system? And so we're seeing a lot of activity for devices because ultimately someone's got to buy it. And so it's not just about getting through FDA, which in our field is always the big goal to get through FDA. It's really not that difficult to get through FDA anymore, relatively speaking. The challenge is the payers. And not even just CMS or Medicare or Blue Cross. It's getting into the hospital systems, where each hospital system is structured differently. They each have different value analysis processes, supply chain processes, and unfortunately they're all different and very fragmented. So it's fascinating for me. I think that there's going to definitely be clear winners to have the technology that addresses that solution, but has a business model that's going to facilitate their launch into the healthcare system where it can actually make a difference. It's really not just about the technology so much anymore. So connected devices, like people are focused on chronic disease management, diabetes, chronic congestive heart failure. The big CardioMEM story that happened in Atlanta, where because of the regulations, because of the policies around healthcare law and reimbursement, there's a readmission penalty hospitals face. If patients are readmitted into the hospital, I think it's 28 days of getting out for a specific procedure. So you're seeing a lot of technologies pop up, both digital health devices that are trying to address that problem. And so if they're going to get readmitted, God, I hope it's on the 30th day. So the hospital doesn't have to eat that cost. So that's kind of where I'm thinking about it.
So I agree with you wholeheartedly. Like my mentors always told me that in the 80s you could do 3 cases and live a very comfortable life. Now we have to do 10 cases a day. So we have to do all of that while providing better care and better outcomes. And insurance pays us less.
And making sure the patient likes you too.
Exactly. So you've got to deal with you got to deal with their orthopedic issue, and then they're going to like you, and if they don't, they're going to go online and blast you. But it doesn't matter. The point is, we have to see more patients and have better quality, all while getting paid less. I mean, back in the 1980s, you got $5,000 for doing a total hip. Now you get $1,500, and the outcomes are way better and way faster. So, there aren't a lot of industries where you just get better outcomes, better quality, and then you get returning, reimbursement. But that's the society that we're living in. That society we're always going to be headed to. So we have to think about things like that. One of the most, I think the thing that I think about in terms of about medical innovation is the electronic medical chart, or PACS. Be able to look at an X-ray, in the palm of your hand or on a screen. I mean, back then, I remember at Grady Hospital as an intern, like literally with old, films, stacks and stacks and stacks. We would have to carry them down 20 pounds at a time and putting them up on that thing and wheeling it over. Can you imagine? Now you just pull it up on your phone, you're like, okay, I'm looking through the picture. Your electronic medical chart. You remember that wall of charts that you had to go and find that patient and all on paper? Now you just, that's incredibly innovative. That allows me to see 60 people a day because I could click through their chart. So, anything that's database thing, like electronic medical charts. And we talk about devices all the time, but just the ability to organize your patients and have their information and call them and tell, that has been incredibly helpful. Online billing, all those things don't get the credit. Now, in my field of orthopedics, our total hips, our implants, these things are lasting 30, 40 years. Back, 30 years ago, you'd be lucky if they lasted 10 years. And then they'd break and you'd have an infection. The implants are getting incredibly sophisticated. And we keep changing them every day. So I think it's hard to pinpoint one specific innovation, but that's where we're all going. We have to have better outcomes, and we have to be quicker. And as you alluded to, surgery time, what gets us out of the operating room faster? These are all things that I think are just wonderful, and that I'm happy to be a part of. And these are things that I think about, what can make me faster, more innovative. The implants we use are just incredibly. You can dial them into a certain angle to get the perfect radial neck, angle for your patient. So, but, I was reading the other day that they're putting fish skin on burns in Brazil, and that they're having great results with taking literally skinning fish and putting it on burns. I read about a group that made a pill that you swallow with a string on it, and you can take an esophageal biopsy. It's incredible ideas. They're game changers. And anytime you hear that word game changer, especially from other doctors, you got to listen in a little bit, because they happen, and they truly are game changers. CardioMIMS, unbelievable. Be able to assess congestive heart failure with a device that's implanted in your own heart. These are all around us, and I think we should all strive to have in any industry. But and the one thing that it's frustrating. The FDA is you can navigate the FDA. It's a long process, but it's tough to compete with other countries, China, even Europe, when you're heavily regulated. And it's kind of, I always get a little disheartened when, I'm going to Switzerland in 2 months because I'm a consultant for a company, but we can't do this work here in the United States, so we have to do it in Switzerland. And it's frustrating because it's they're not buried with all the regulations and red tape that we have. So that's why all these implants are being tested in Europe or China 6 years before we get in the US. And you would think with all our advances in technology that we would be at the forefront of that, but we're just in some ways very hindered by our own government. But that's a discussion for another time. But anyways, again, we want to be faster, better. Any innovation that can help in those fields is fine by me.
Thanks, Greg. I'm going to have to segue now. I got the signal that we're going into our Q&A session. But the way we're kicking it off is I've asked each of the panelists in the back of their very brilliant minds to be thinking of a question for one other panelist. So, Cory, you're on first, and then we'll go to the audience.
So this is for Greg. So one thing that fascinated me about your bio is this, doing an engineering type degree and then going on to be a doctor. So was that in the back of your mind at the beginning, or I mean, were you like charting that out, or so that like I was curious about, one, was that in the back of your mind, and when like what happened that made you realize that you could really tap into what you had done as an engineer and bring it into what you're doing now to have this great idea happen.
So when I was a kid, I used to play with Legos all the time. I actually built a transmission out of Legos when I was like 7. And I took apart my dad's lawnmower and built a go-kart. So I was an engineer my whole life. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to build things, create things. I became a doctor because when I was in Atlanta at Tech, I needed extra money because I was a poor college kid. And one of my friends was harvesting organs for a company called Lifelink. It was Lifeline. Lifelink of Georgia, I think. And so we would get called in the middle of the night, we'd go to the coroner's office, and we would take out bones and harvest them. And it was great money. You get like $350 a case, and I needed to pay my rent. So I literally just did it to pay rent. And then, this is a true story. I did not want to be a doctor. It was the furthest thing from my mind. I hated blood, but I needed money. So I was like, all right, this isn't so bad. And then, one of the guys I work with, he says, "You're incredible. You got good. You're good with your hands. You should think about this." And I was like, "No, it's not for me." And then I worked my way up at a company and started doing hearts and lungs and all this other cool stuff. And then they let me scrub in on a few real organ donor cases. And I switched. I started taking bio and organic chemistry in my 3rd year and applied to medical school in my 3rd year, took the MCAT. It was literally just a screeching halt because of, that's life. I mean, things happen. But, I guess I never thought I was going to be a doctor until I needed money.
Okay, Nicole, now your question for one of the other panelists.
My question is for Tiffany. What advice would you give to a person who has this great idea but isn't quite sure what the next step is and how to get it from an idea to maybe market?
Yeah, so that's kind of why we were founded. To ask, to look into your ecosystem and talk to people who have been there and done that. The biggest mistake that I see people make is rushing in to build a prototype and spending money on that before even understanding what the patient population is, what the regulatory pathway is, what the competitive landscape looks like. Because a lot of those things will drive the specifications of your prototype. And so you kind of, and especially what we do, it's expensive. MedTech takes a long time. It's really freaking hard, and it costs a lot of money. And so you kind of have to have the chops to deal with that. And so I'd much rather people spend the sweat equity, if you will, to do their homework, to understand what they're getting into. Because things like regulatory pathways and the addressable market sizes will really determine whether or not a company is viable. So for example, the riskiest medical devices out there are referred to as class 3 medical devices. We're talking heart valves and stents and some orthopedic implants now. But the market size for those may not be very big. And so class 3 automatically means big neon sign, super expensive. 10 years, $100 million clinical trials. And so if your addressable market isn't big enough to support that investment, you're never going to be able to get investors for it. Yet we've seen people kind of wander around and spend gobs of money on their own, putting their patent portfolio together, filing in other countries, paying those maintenance fees, and then working with various prototype shops and things like that, because it's fun to do that, right? It's fun activity. But if you can do the homework and talk to experts up front before you launch, it really puts you on the path, and making those go, no-go decisions along the way. So breaking it into tranches, and then asking, kind of revalidating everything every step of the way.
You have the mic. Why don't you ask the next question, and then Greg takes that.
So my question was for you, actually. So one of the things I've been really curious about is, and you mentioned cybersecurity, and data. So I kind of came back. My med tech exposure has been in regenerative medicine and electromechanical devices, and so I kind of understand how IP works in that area. But I'm curious, as you're seeing new, data and algorithms. Seeing new opportunities in security. I think there's a lot of transition from like fintech and what's happened there into healthcare. What are some of the challenges in addressing, getting IP around that?
That's a great question. And I think the starting point is understanding what you're dealing with, because as we mentioned before, this field is growing so quickly that there aren't clear boxes to kind of check. What we're seeing a lot with our clients is they don't have the policies and procedures in place to protect whatever data that they do have and that they are using. So it kind of starts at a top-down approach, getting the C-level team, if there is such a team, on board with understanding how to protect the data, how to kind of unpack it, if you will, and it kind of goes back to what Greg was saying at the beginning, and just having the right team in place, and understanding what you're dealing with.
And I guess, Greg, you have to ask Cory a question. Is that right? Okay.
Well, I mean, this question can be for all three. It's really just what sort of patterns, what have you seen has been a successful formula for, to get a patent, to grow a company, to do informatics, to test stuff? I mean, what is a successful formula? If you had to describe some quality or some patterns, is it the team? Is it the idea? Is it the drive? Is it your intelligence? Is it the hard work? What is a successful formula? We'll start with Tiffany.
Good Lord. So I really focus, I have seen over the last 5 or 6 years, if we can get the right team at the right time, we can go really fast through kind of FDA. By the right team, I mean that they're coachable, that they'll follow directions and follow the process, because product development for medtech, it's pretty straightforward. It is, there are, feels like sometimes there's boogeymen in every corner that you got to kind of watch out for, and it's complicated because we're dealing with scientists, clinicians, government regulators, and the needs of investors, and so kind of serving all those different groups is a challenge. But if the team can really lean in to navigate that, and at the right time, I mean that they don't have to put the toothpaste back in the tube. So Nicole mentioned about doing it right the first time. So really starting with the end in mind and building a solid quality process for getting to market. A big mistake that I see startups make is, because this field is so expensive, startups take shortcuts, primarily around quality systems. And Greg and I talked about this a couple of years ago. And doing a quality system and really doing some of those early testing, it's not fun, it's not sexy, it can be tedious. And you don't really know how it's going to come back to bite you for 5 or 6 years, because it takes that long to get through FDA and have an exit. But when I talk to industry, when I talk to investors, the number one problem, their number one complaint is not following the process. And so what happens is that really comes back from a due diligence standpoint. And the first thing they'll go out is look at the risk factors in there, because that's essentially what they're acquiring. And they'll either walk away from the deal or they'll kill a valuation in an hour. And I've seen it happen. So that, for me, that's the kind of model of success. And you can start to see pretty early on that ultimately, bless you, it's not about it's not really about the technology, it's about that execution.
Okay, Cory, and then Nicole, and then we will go to the audience after that.
So my sphere is a little different because it's mostly about the research and the collaborations. So I would say the first thing is, well, you always have to have a good idea, but you have to be able to execute it. So I think that the first part of my formula certainly is I find out what everybody is doing. I know if I have an idea, anyone remotely close to my idea, I know what they're doing. So I make sure that I have a real understanding of what's out there. The second thing is when I go to implement something, I try a whole slew of different things. I mean, a lot of things fail. It may slow the process down, but a lot of times you may come up with like a very powerful discovery after you've worked on something for a long time. So not being afraid to try a whole slew of things, and then once you've targeted that thing, that's when you focus and you do everything to make sure everything's perfected. And I think one of the key things for me is having a good team. I don't care, I'd rather have a small team and a good team, and always making sure that my collaborations are sound, you know, really nurturing the collaborations with the doctors that I have, understanding their field, and being able to speak to them, I think, and make sure things happen.
I think from a legal perspective, the clients who I've seen who are most successful make a plan. So they take their idea, they sit down with their marketing people, with their business folks, with their innovators, with their lawyers, and they say, here's what we want to do. Here's what we can afford to do in 6 months, in 12 months, in 5 years. Here's what has to be done because it's required by law. Here's what we're most excited about. And you have to be able to kind of, again, unpack your ideas and find that timeline approach. And if you do that, then I think you can be more successful.
Okay, Mickey is going to be our mic runner. Questions from the audience, please.
First question? Come over here. As far as I can get.
Sort of a standing
So I've been thinking about your comment, and I'll paraphrase it and get it wrong, but it's basically FDA approval is nothing compared to insurers and hospitals, and that's who you really got to ultimately convince. What to my perspective is a game-changing announcement this week from Amazon and Berkshire Hathaway and JP Morgan, I guess, that said, hey, these are some folks with enough billions of dollars to be a game changer and really change the way technology and medicine happen, right? As a startup guy in medical technology, I'm thinking, forget all those players. These are the guys I'm going to go try to sell to now, right? I'm curious what your thoughts are, and you know, how does something like this have a potential to change it?
So from my perspective, I'm always a little cautious when big tech giants decide that they're going to get into a highly regulated industry. You guys remember the story about Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, and if you look at her board, and I still, like, to this day, like, how on earth did they let her execute in that way? I mean, it's unfreaking believable. So that's the first thing there, that if they need to get the right team in place who really understand the regulatory constraints when you're dealing with true medical technologies. I think where the opportunity is, I talked earlier about convergence, and it's really this balance between consumer healthcare and treating people in their home and consumer wearables, and how that data interacts with the EMRs where the clinicians can really see it. And I think over time we'll see some new regulations there on how that data is protected, how it's going to drive clinical decision making, and if it is, how that's going to be regulated. But at the end of the day, for things that happen within the healthcare system, the boss of that is still the value analysis committee and the supply chain within the healthcare system. And they're making the decisions on what comes into the hospital. The Amazon thing may lower the cost on the distribution to those endpoints, which everybody wins on that. But I think the takeaway for startups too is just to have the data. No matter who you're selling to, they, 15 years ago, you could talk about saving OR time, right? And you could pitch it in a presentation, and the person you're pitching it to would be like, yeah, that makes sense. I can see, that's logical. Now that they want to see the data, and data takes time, and it's expensive, and you have to present it in a way that they want. And the other challenge there is that a hospital payer, a Blue Cross, an FDA, they all want to see data. It may not be the same data. And so really, to Nicole's point about having a plan, understanding what all of those touch points are. So when you're doing clinical study or you're doing your analysis, you're only doing it once. So I see this as a new potential outlet that you need to understand what they're going to want to see in order to adopt the product.
I do want to say something. We actually, speaking of Theranos, we have a saying in our company, #NeverTheranos. So you really should read the story of what not to do and how you can fool a bunch of people. And it's really almost like a hysteria. And I remember I was actually thinking about trying to invest in Theranos. And my wife's an ICU nurse, and she's like, that's an impossible idea, Greg. You cannot get an INR from a drop of blood. You can't. And she was right.
Any other questions?
This is for Greg, Cory, and Nicole. Given that your solution, Greg, represents a portfolio of technologies from diverse suppliers across the world, did you experience openness and collaboration, and was there a tension between that and hesitation to protect the technologies that you wanted to access? And then there's an observation, and that is Tesla has open sourced all of its patents, and the implications for its suppliers are that they cannot sue them because they have open sourced their patents.
That's a really good question. It's not something we all want to think about. It's kept me up many nights. Your suppliers. There's plenty of people who have a digital sensor. There's plenty of people who can make an X-ray tube. You can't have just one, because if you have just one, you're going to get pinned into a corner. We started off with 4 suppliers for our sensor in 4 different countries, and I don't speak Japanese, so I can't, I don't have a lot of bargaining power with some of those. So when you create your supply chain, no device is made in one shop. You have to get stuff from Taiwan or from Japan or from India or from Canada, and you have to bring it all to one place and put it together. And in our device, there's 5 essential parts, all coming from 5 different areas of the world. We almost screwed ourselves by having one supplier for an X-ray tube. And when we had our design making it, we almost, you can give that person a lot of leverage when it comes down to exiting or who gets what. So you have to always think about that. And it's not, the best thing, as we all alluded to, and I think you would warn anybody, is get it up front. This is what we own. You're building this for us. This is ours. Get it in writing. Every person we speak to, we have a non-disclosure agreement. It's become so commonplace that it's almost expected. You don't talk to anybody without an NDA. You don't talk to people without upfront saying what is yours and what is mine. That way, you avoid that difficult conversation and that courtroom in the future, and you don't lose what is rightfully yours. So have a discussion and get everything in writing, and you should protect yourself at all costs.
It looks like we just have a couple of minutes left, so a minute for each of you.
Yeah, so one of the things I did with dealing with suppliers, so I deal with companies in China, Japan, all over the place. But one thing I found was pretty useful, I was able to like find chains of people who have relationships with each other, and that worked really well because like I was discussing something with microscopy system I was designing, and he said, well, you know, this particular part, we have a relationship with this manufacturer, and then we kind of developed like this circle of a relationship, so that worked. Another thing is, sometimes I spend more for things than going cheaply because of the relationships of who I'm working with. I spend a long time filtering out who I'm gonna work with and make sure that we have a relationship, because one of the things is, compared to who they're servicing, my shop is small. So they don't necessarily, they're not always very, you know, customer service and all this, because, you know, they're like, we'll drop it there, you bring a truck, we'll send, you know, that type of thing. So I just make sure that the relationship is gonna be strong. And then in terms of non-disclosure, I have a great art of speaking nothing. I can speak nothing for a long time to get where I wanna go. And then when it gets down to what's important, I always have, one of the reasons why I'm doing this in a university is that we have patent attorneys that I don't have to pay, and I call the Office of Research before I even have conversations with people, and they tell me what to do, and they also provide the documents. So I have protection, and one of the reasons why I'm doing it in a university is because I have their team of lawyers behind me, because it's their interest too, so.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think to echo what both of you were saying is that you want to make sure that what you think you have protected is what the document says. Because I can't tell you how many times we've had a client come and say, oh no, I own everything. I say, okay, let me look at the contract, and the contract says you share ownership, or you've given all of your ownership away, but that's not what the conversations were had. So I think the kind of wrap up is just make sure that you have the right team in place, that you're putting everything in writing, that you're having the right advisors to help protect you, and then you'll be off to a great start.
Alicia, take us away.
All right. Big thanks to Tiffany, Greg, Murem, Cory, and Nicole for sharing your experiences with us. This is really amazing. Thank you. Up next at 4 o'clock in the Guild Hall, we have another interesting panel discussion, Time for Funding, When to Raise Money for Your Startup. And in this room, we have AI and machine learning demystified. So have fun, stay curious.